Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third in this series of London lectures, Words and Worlds. So this evening it's a great pleasure to have with us Professor Luvell Anderson from Syracuse University. Luvell is well known for his work on the philosophy of language, the philosophy of race and aesthetics. He, as it happens, has co-written various papers with Ernie Lepore, who was our guest last week, and he will be known to many of you as one of the co-editors of the Oxford Companion to the Philosophy of, the Routledge Companion to the Philosophy of Race. So, Luvell, thanks so much for joining us this evening. His paper will be entitled Racial Realities. Over to you.
Thank you all for joining me on a drizzly night. Clearly, people's perception of the world, its moral and political character, is influenced by race in some way. The Pew Research Center published a report in August of 2021 detailing differing opinions about the United States' racial history and how to address it in the wake of a year after George Floyd's murder by Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin. According to the report, a majority of Black Americans, 58%, said U.S. institutions and laws needed to be completely rebuilt because they are fundamentally biased against some groups. Contrast this with 30% of Hispanic Americans, 24% of Asian Americans, and 18% of white Americans who said the same. Protest over Floyd's murder did not just take place in the U.S., but resonated with people around the world, sparking protests in places like London, Berlin, Paris, and Vancouver. These protests were not only about what happened to Floyd, but triggered homegrown experiences of life as a Black or brown person in these places. Assa Traoré, sister of 24-year-old Adama, who died in police custody in Paris, reflected on Floyd in a Facebook post. She writes, "How can one not think of Adama's terrible suffering when he had 3 police officers on him and he was repeating, 'I can't breathe.' His name was George Floyd, who, just like Adama, died because they were Black." Assa's statement that George and Adama died because they were Black expresses the idea that their reality was to some extent determined by their race. The multiracial coalition of protesters during the summer of 2020 in the US gives the impression that many people are coming to appreciate more and more the difference race makes in the making of public policy and its application. At least this is what happens to be the case, at least this is what appears to be the case, given increases in support for reform of some kind. The interpretation of these events by protesters more or less share a common understanding of racial history. The injustices suffered by Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, Adama Traoré, as well as the protest over Chris Kaba's killing by police in South London, are understood from a particular place. Speaking to a crowd of protesters at Manchester's Central Library, Nahela Ashraf, co-chair of the group Stand Up for Racism, linked the demonstration that took place there in September of this year to the Black Lives Matter movement. She writes, "It wasn't just because we recognized that was a problem over there in the US. We recognize that systemic racism is inherent in Britain as well, and it's inherent in our police forces. A report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities conducted last year begs to differ. Put simply, we no longer see a Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. The impediments and disparities do exist. They are varied, and ironically, very few of them are directly to do with racism. Too often, racism is the catch-all explanation, and can be simply implicitly accepted rather than explicitly examined. The Commission acknowledges that racism is a real force in the UK, but that geography, family influence, socioeconomic background, culture, and religion play a more significant role in one's life chances. Additionally, the Commission also called for ending the use of the term BAME, Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. They see the term as describing a group that is held together by no more than what it is not. In short, racially and ethnically identifying language obscures and divides rather than unites. Obviously, Nahela and the Commission have different understandings of British society. What gives rise to these differing understandings, and how might they be bridged? Can they be bridged? Pushback against racial history and/or the current situation was also present in the United States. Chants of Black Lives Matter were routinely met with counter chants of All Lives Matter. For some, the counter chant signifies the denial of racial specificity as relevant for addressing injustice. All human beings stand on equal ground and should be treated fairly, regardless of racial identity. For others, or in addition, the counter chant signifies a denial that Black people face systemic racial injustices at all. All Lives Matter, coupled with Blue Lives Matter, a phrase that expresses support for the police, make this interpretation much clearer. Police shootings of Black people, apparently whether armed or unarmed, have more to do with the actions of the one who was shot. The fight against a particularly damning understanding of racial history in the US is front and center in current culture wars. People like Christopher Rufo and James Lindsay have waged a war against what they call wokeness by weaponizing the phrase critical race theory. Rufo revealed the rationale for the campaign against critical race theory in a tweet on April 29th, 2021. To win the war against wokeness, we have to create persuasive language. From now on, we should refer to critical race theory in education as state-sanctioned racism. That's the new weapon in the language war. Jeffrey Miller amps things up further, responding to Rufo with the following tweet. It's not just state-sanctioned racism. It's race war propaganda. The goal is obviously to promote violent divisions along racial and ethnic lines. Again, we see a divergence in how people understand current social conditions and racial history. We also see the value attributed to language in the fight over the preferred understanding for the public imagination. But I want to switch focus for a moment to highlight an often invisible factor in public perception, at least invisible to the public eye. That factor is the underlying narrative that provokes perception. What I mean to pick out here is captured by David Snow and Robert Benford's definition of framing, which they define as the construction of interpretive schemata that simplify and condense the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, experiences, and sequences of actions within one's present or past environment. Snow and Benford derived the concept from Irving Goffman, who focused primarily on the ability of individuals to locate, perceive, identify, and label occurrences within their life space and at the world at large. Snow and Benford's emphasis, by contrast, is on the collective action of movements rather than individuals. According to Snow and Benford, movements often try to access what they call master frames, a generic type of collective action frame that is wider in scope and influence than run-of-the-mill social movement frames. Examples of master frames include the rights frame and the populist frame. These frames are flexible enough for various social movements to make use of them. Think of the populist rhetoric used by movements supporting Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Both movements adopt a for the people frame to attract supporters and distinguish themselves from opponents. Social movements, like the Movement for Black Lives and Stand Up for Racism, recognize they are not just fighting against discriminatory practices. They are also battling discursive practices that help to maintain either support for such practices or a disinterested apathy in the broader population. As social movement scholars like Sidney Tarrow note, as well as philosopher Michelle Moody Adams in her book, Making Space for Justice, social movements attempt to gain followers and support by introducing new meanings into the public discourse. New meanings are needed to alter a public's political imagination. These projects face real challenges, however. I believe one challenge concerns the backing narratives of frames I mentioned earlier. As I'm sure we can all attest, it has proven difficult to hold sustained and constructive dialogue between oppositional groups. Depending on the nature of opposition, the ability to get to common ground is often impeded by the framings each group employs to understand the world. For instance, hardcore leftists and evangelical conservatives appear worlds apart, using starting points and articulations of concepts that make it nearly impossible for them to agree conceptually on most things. And though practical considerations may force them to momentarily compromise, it seems unlikely that this is sustainable. One thing I believe sustains divergent understandings of racial history and social conditions, obviously, is race. But what role does race play? I am mostly uninterested in metaphysical questions concerning the reality of race, its ontological status, for current purposes. My main concern is about the role and impact of race on our perceptions and understanding. It is useful, I believe, to speak of race in terms of what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. In his book, The Logic of Practice, Bourdieu describes habitus as systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures, that is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. Loïc Wacquamp paraphrases this in simpler form. The way society becomes deposited in persons in the form of lasting dispositions, or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinate ways, which then guide them. Part of what I want to draw from this is the idea that history is embodied within us. We enflesh and enliven inherited histories while simultaneously adapting and interpreting situations new and old. Putting Bourdieu's notion of habitus together with Sarah Ahmed's understanding of racialization, researcher Amit Singh describes the racial habitus as colonial history turned into nature. For Bourdieu, the habitus operates like second nature, obscuring as natural what is arbitrary. And according to Ahmed, the social world is determined by colonialism, which makes the world white, which is, of course, a world ready for certain kinds of bodies, as a world that puts certain objects within their reach. What I like about thinking of race as racial habitus is that it provides a way of conceiving of this thing as we experience it. This is quite important. It gives the sense that we are both guided by and guiding our racial identities. Let us see how racial habitus can help us think about challenges it raises for our imaginative capacities and the divides in understanding I alluded to earlier. Achieving racial justice means, at least to some extent, reimagining the world and the relations between those who inhabit it. The vocabulary of our discourse matters for how we envision what is possible. Kevin Quashie, professor of English at Brown University, notes the shift that must take place in language to imagine something different. Quashie queries, what would it mean to consider Black aliveness, especially given how readily and literally Blackness is indexed to death? To behold such aliveness, we have to imagine a Black world. We have to imagine a Black world so as to surpass the everywhere and every way of Black death, of Blackness that is understood only through such a vocabulary. This equation of Blackness and death is indisputable and enduring, surely, but if we want to try to conceptualize aliveness, we have to begin somewhere else. Quashie is concerned here primarily with the Black reader and Black literature. What he proposes avoiding is the conceptualizing of Blackness as it occurs currently, usually tied to anti-Blackness and death. I'd like to borrow this idea for a moment, if I can, to think about the implications for our current discussion. What does it mean to consider Black aliveness? And what kinds of constraints exist on our imaginative capacities? The clashes in understanding referenced earlier represent what I call hermeneutical impasses. Broadly speaking, a hermeneutical impasse refers to a break in understanding due to a gap in shared hermeneutical resources. Hermeneutical resources are essentially cognitive, affective, and expressive tools we use to make sense of and communicate our experiences. In my paper, Hermeneutical Impasses, I describe 4 basic types. Type 1 impasses have as their source a lack of shared linguistic items. For instance, interlocutors who do not share a common language. Resolving this impasse would involve supplying a common medium of exchange, or maybe a translator. Once this is provided, moving from a state of non-understanding to understanding becomes possible. Type 2 impasses involve interlocutors who share the same language in some sense, yet find themselves with non-overlapping sets of hermeneutical resources to make sense of at least some conversational contributions. Participants in this interaction share a medium of exchange in some sense. The source of the impasse is the places where their hermeneutical resources do not overlap. Resolving this impasse might involve clarification or translation of specific words or concepts. With type 3 impasses, linguistic remedies are less effective. For instance, in grappling with a difficult text, an impasse can arise that need not be due to ignorance of the meaning of words. Conceivably, you could know or come to know the meanings of all the words used in the text and still be left with a gap in understanding. What you need to fill this gap is not immediately clear. It could be the possession of some concept, certain beliefs, or experiences. Whatever is missing, linguistic knowledge will not necessarily resolve the impasse. Type 3 impasses also include cases where the gap is supported by a lack of cultural familiarity. More broadly, the hermeneutic obstacle involved is non-linguistic ignorances. Someone unfamiliar with the intricacies of African American life in large southern urban centers in the United States will likely miss much of the humor in Donald Glover's show Atlanta, for instance. Even if a translation manual is provided for the African American English used in the dialogues, outsiders to this cultural paradigm will lack the familiarity with personalities, practices, and situations crucial for uptake. And to the extent this gap can be closed, it is evident this will not be accomplished by learning new linguistic items. Finally, type 4 impasses are characterized by instances in which understanding is assumed but not achieved due to the interpreters holding certain prejudices. According to philosopher Miranda Fricker, prejudices are judgments, which may have a positive or a negative valence, and which display some, typically epistemically culpable resistance to counter evidence owing to some affective investment on the part of the subject. One example of this might be a Hollywood executive who is predisposed to think white viewing audiences will be hesitant to embrace stories that center Black life and Black characters, despite recent successes in film and TV. I suggest type 3 and 4 impasses are generated and exacerbated by racial habitus. Because our identities have been forged in a world determined by colonialism, we are operating with discourses that, as Linda Alcoff puts it, involves the reinvocation of colonial racial knowledge. This much is evidenced by our continued use of racial categories. Whatever it would mean to imagine Black aliveness, there's reason to think, at least for certain racial habituses, that in a discursive world where Blackness has routinely been indexed to death, this would be an exceedingly difficult task. So what is to be done? The first step may be realizing the extent to which our imaginations are implicated in the histories we've inherited. Those insensitive to these oft unacknowledged traces cannot hope to be good conscious players in the construction of a new world that abandons colonial conceptions for something else, something more equitable and just. Racial habitus poses an especially difficult challenge for, as James Baldwin puts it, those who think they are white. He sums up the challenge in this way. Because they think they are white, they do not dare confront the ravage and the lie of their history. Because they think they are white, they cannot allow themselves to be tormented by the suspicion that all men are brothers. Because they think they are white, they are looking for or bombing into existence stable populations, cheerful natives, and cheap labor. Because they think they are white, they believe, as even no child believes, in the dream of safety. Because they think they are white, however vociferous they may be, and however multitudinous, they are as speechless as Lot's wife, looking backward, changed into a pillar of salt. The only way through, according to Baldwin, is to face this history that is so monstrous it became necessary to misrepresent it as something else. This is one of the gravest challenges I think we face. The challenge is grave because it is embodied in the very thing many of us use to orient ourselves and thereby understand the world. The challenge is grave because we cannot achieve it without allowing our imaginations to be disrupted, and for many, that is a challenge too frightful to bear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions?
The first thing is, thank you very much for your talk. The second is with respect to the four types that you have described. It sounds like the four types apply to individuals. Can you say a little bit more about how they might apply to either groups or institutions?
Yeah, good. So initially when I wrote that paper, I had individuals in mind. Right? So I wrote it in the midst of the Colin Kaepernick dealings with the NFL and thinking about the response to his kneeling and the response to Black Lives Matter that sort of emerged around that time, right? And in part, I was thinking about the sort of obstinacy of the all lives matter understanding of the phrase, right? I wasn't yet thinking about racial habitus, right? So one way to, I guess, loop these things in is to think about, okay, what is sort of sourcing one's understanding or perceptions of what's happening there? So it's still going to be sort of thinking about individual responses, right? Because we don't respond to things as groups. Ultimately, each one of us is responsible for our responses, right? But our perceptions and responses have a source of some sort. And so now what I'm trying to do is explicitly connect up the source that sort of funds us, works as the foundation for our perceptions and our understandings, right? That gives rise to these individual responses. It just so happens that these sources they pattern in a particular sort of way, right? So for Bourdieu, the habitus is a material sort of thing, right? So the habitus basically forms in material conditions, and so it's not always the same. It's not a social. It's not a trans-historical sort of thing, right? It develops more shifts depending on the context and conditions in which it emerges and develops, right? But nonetheless, we come into the world inheriting these histories. We're socialized into certain roles. We're taught how to act and think and speak as responsible members of our families, communities, nations, societies, such like that, right? So what I want to do is sort of hold open both individual action and this group or collective thing that sort of undergirds it. Right? So that you're not just sort of looking at one place or the other, but there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the two.
Well, I kind of just wanted to push on the idea of hermeneutical impasses, where it seems like a lot of this is kind of unintentional, or perhaps it comes from kind of just a place of ignorance. And I wonder what you have to say about the Millsian idea of kind of an ignorance that pushes back in a way that it's not really an impasse, but rather in some way intentional, kind of non-confronting of these impasses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good. So I think what I say is compatible with you're talking about the notion of white ignorance, right?
Yeah.
So I think what I say is compatible with that, because even in those cases, I think Mills thinks, right, that one's perceptions or reactions of behavior need not be consciously sort of motivated by an explicit recognition of a cultivated ignorance, right? So that is, you need not be acting, you can act in good faith, but nonetheless, because your dispositions and social perceptions are conditioned in a particular sort of way, you're basically, again, to borrow the language of Baldwin and what you're embodying these histories, right? So they're with you, they're motivating your actions, your responses, and so forth. But nonetheless, we can think about a particular kind of formation, right? A particular kind of white consciousness that for Mills both can be described as a system, but also as kind of epistemic situation, right? That you're sort of always sort of in contact with, having to negotiate, some way navigate, right? So what I say, I think it's compatible with Mills' story, because again, if we think of race as a racial habitus, it's essentially doing a similar kind of work that he's doing in White Ignorance, right? Pointing to a pattern development of a particular kind of consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess you're not in any way differentiating between if it's unconscious or habituated versus in some way perhaps even consciously pushing back, if that makes sense. Right? Because there's this idea of some people might just like consciously not want to confront it,
Good, yeah.
versus others who are just naturally ignorant, perhaps grew up in like a homogeneous community, whatever. You know what I'm saying? There's a bit of a difference between.
I see. Yeah, so good. So I take people like Chris Rufo or Steve Bannon or somebody like that. They're not affecting ignorance in an unconscious way, right? They have a very deliberate thing they want to achieve. Insofar as they generate conflicts of interpretation or understanding, I take them not to be engaged in a good faith, legitimate, what I'll call a hermeneutic situation, right? Where you're attempting to come to an understanding with someone else. I think in order to be in a genuinely hermeneutic situation, you both have to be amenable to being transformed by what's offered, right? And I think for people like Rufo and Bannon, that's just not their situation, right? They're the sort of propagandists who are out to achieve their own personal interest or whatever. They're not interested in being a part of a cooperative, constructive project that constructs meaning and understandings for a shared world.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to ask if you could say more about the relationship of embodiment. You had a line that really struck me. You said that history is embodied within us and we enflesh histories. And while I understand that you don't want to go into an ontological discussion, how does that, what did you mean by that, and how does that shape the hermeneutic turn that you make in your paper?
Good, yeah. So I guess part of what I am intending to resist is this idea that that we occupy a certain kind of neutral perspective at any given point. Right? That our perceptions and our understandings are always shaped by what has come before us, what we've inherited. So that the kinds of choices we make about meaning or understanding or whatever is always entangled with those meanings and understandings that have been passed down to us through our caregivers, right? Or the communities that we've been sort of socialized in.
So to what extent then does that limit the imagination that you're hoping for, or the change in imagination that you're hoping for?
Yeah, good. So I think for some of these things, right? So I think in principle, we can alter or transform these understandings through engagement with understandings we've never thought about before or encountered before, right? But some of those things are more entrenched than others, right? So let's think about people who grow up in super religious contexts, who find it difficult to sort of break away from what they've been told in their particular religious tradition, right? That might constrain what they think about, whether or not it's permissible to go to movies or play cards, for example, right? Given sort of one sort of Christian tradition in the U.S., right? Where it's not just sort of propositions that you've come into contact with, that you've inhabited, but they also sort of seep into the bones, right? So that you might feel emotionally or viscerally a tug, right, that says, okay, this is not an action I'm supposed to do because I've been sort of trained this way my whole life, or at least for up to this point, while also thinking like, oh, well, this is terrible. I mean, this is obviously not, so I don't think this is false. I've come into contact with other things that have provoked me to rethink how I think about stuff like that. But I still feel the tug and the pull, from the practices I've been engaged with in my communities. Right? So I think in that way, that sort of affective bit that comes along with what we learn and what we inherit is the part that can constrain the imagination, right? Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And actually, my question maybe builds a little bit on the last question, so I'm really pleased that you asked that. It's actually like situating that kind of question in the context of allyship. So I guess there's like mixed sort of arguments out there, right, in terms of how possible it is to be a good ally as somebody who's not from the social group in question. And a lot of that is situated in like ideas about epistemic authority, like you can't possibly have the right knowledge that, or like knowledge of, or whatever, somebody's experience that allows you to properly kind of be the right sort of ally. But of course, it sounds like you're introducing, or at least you could read some of what you're saying as introducing this more habitus directed, like epistemic or habitus authority almost, that I guess could both maybe limit chances for allyship, but also it sounds like you're open to the idea that there could, you could maybe try and insert yourself in certain life experiences that help you to build up this type of habitus, right, that maybe help you to be a better ally. So kind of like a similar question, but I wondered if you could talk about it in the context of allyship a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, so part of it is thinking about, okay, if this Bourdieuian story is right about sort of the formation of habitus and so forth, what are the conditions under which it's possible to alter it or change it, and so forth. And I think for him it's going to mean altering the conditions that you encounter. That's going to be at least part of it, anyway. So that at least means tracking in different circles than you otherwise would have. Encountering things that you would not encounter in the circles that you normally track in. If we're thinking in the context of social movements and movement work, there it becomes tricky, right? Because then if we're thinking about who has the authority to speak, who should be in on devising the goals of the movement and so forth, right? I think this can mean different things in different contexts. So I have a friend working on, not on this particular thing, but on something in the region that has to do with notions of deference, right? So, which I think this is related to. So it's about, okay, when does one defer? Who has to defer? Individuals who are not a part of the group, do they ever have license to speak? Right? I say it's tricky because I think there are a number of factors at cross points. I think at face value, you feel the pull of out group members really should basically shut up, sit down, and not say much. Be a foot soldier, do what you're told, kind of thing. But at the same time, there's another danger in the vicinity with in-groups, which is that sometimes it happens that certain in-groups develop a kind of protectionist hermeneutic, right? Where it's not so much about the content of what's being said, it's about who's saying it. Sometimes that can be counterproductive for their own interests. Right? Epistemically speaking, it doesn't look to me in principle that out-group members never have anything value worth contributing. But I think it's a different question from whether or not out-group members ever have standing and what it means to gain standing. Right? And standing looks like something that the groups themselves have to grant or something like that, right? So there's a way in which there might be something epistemically valuable, but politically or something like that, one has to gain some kind of trust in order to be able to contribute.
Thank you for your talk. I think towards the end, if I'm understanding correctly, your suggestion was that to imagine new meanings for concepts, we sort of have to look backwards and kind of make explicit the habitus that sort of structured the past. I'm curious about that. Like, why is it important to? I mean, I agree, but why is it important to sort of uncover that, to imagine new meanings?
Yeah. So if one is not looking back, you overlook the mistakes you're making, or at least could be making. And so I've been in situations where those who thought they were allies to the anti-racist causes or whatever, and operating in good faith, but they're operating with concepts that they didn't recognize were sort of antithetical to the goal itself. Right? And there was a kind of resistance to thinking about those things, thinking about the concepts they were operating on. So just the kind of, the orientation itself made it difficult to work with them because they just weren't open to being transformed in a way that would actually put them closer to the values that they stated they wanted to embrace and the goals they wanted to work for. So refusing to look back basically obscures our view of what's actually there, which then obscures where we might head.
There was a question in the front, yeah.
So you mentioned about people thinking that they're white and how that's problematic, and I was wondering if you could say something about how people thinking that other people are white and kind of denying their experience, how that's problematic, because whenever I look at things about racism, it seems like the Middle East is always kind of ignored. And I mean, if you look at the experience of Ukrainian refugees compared to Middle Eastern refugees, there's some obvious racism there. But like, I've been told that I pass as white, and it just seems like invisible racism that's still not being addressed. So.
Yeah. So this is thing that Baldwin says in this video, The Price of the Ticket, where he basically says, as long as you think you're white, I'm forced to think I'm black. So that is, whiteness, in the way that he's talking about it, structures the world in such a way that it basically has an impact on like all relations. Right? And yeah, so it also kind of dominates the discourse, right? In a way that obscures other things happening, right? So subtle discriminations we might make that might make a difference for how we understand the social order in various regions of the world, for example, right? Or how we understand the geopolitics of, say, Ukraine and Russia versus, I don't know, Sudanese immigrants coming into the EU. Right? I think even this part shows that, suggests to me that Ahmed is right? That the social world is formed a colonial world. And you can see how that's sort of obscuring our discussions about, what's possible politically, and it's obscuring our imaginations. So I guess the thing at the end that I say are that this is the gravest challenge. Because you can see how pervasive a problem it is and how it sort of works its way into our understandings of a lot of things, not just sort of race relations between two groups of people. But there was a bit at the end that you said that I didn't quite catch. Could you repeat that bit about? I didn't quite catch the point.
I guess Middle Eastern refugees are just seen as invisible or like a threat. And I mean, the Middle East has been colonialized, but it just never seems to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I guess in a way this mirrors what so I have a student who's working on Native American philosophy and so the social contract tradition. And so she thinks about sort of the use of the concept of savage in the history of Western political thought, how it's been applied to Native American people and indigenous people on the North American continent and so forth, who don't even rise to the level of the human and worthy of engagement. So you might think, yeah, so the Middle Eastern region seems to be functioning somewhat in that, like that, right? So don't even rise to the level of proper concern because not viewed as, I don't know.
I want to come back to her question about allyship. And when she was asking her question, I was connecting it to what you said to him about the hermeneutic impasses originally conceived of on the level of the individual rather than the social. But how would you respond to the possibility that maybe the role of the ally then is to be the seed of epistemic resistance within that social grouping? Would that make sense?
As a kind of catalyst to disrupt customary understandings or something like that. So I think it's both it has potential and it's also dangerous. I think we see instances where it works, other instances where it backfires because then the disruptor becomes the point of focus and ultimately a distraction from the original goal. Right? So yeah, I see potential in it. And I do think that it seems right to me that that's a role that one should take up if one is in a position to do so, but also to recognize that there's a danger too, and so to guard against becoming sort of the center of attention, or the focus, right? That is having the attention displaced on oneself.
I have a question about the work that habitus does on groups, and I'm thinking about particular instances of people who are in group, who have these sort of like the propagandist stance, if you will. Some examples that come to my mind, these may be controversial, but that's fine. Think of people like, in the context of the US, the person formerly known as Kanye West, Ice Cube, Jay-Z. I'm thinking about people like this, and I want to know how that fits in with respect to the things we're talking about, because you've been talking about out-groups and in-groups, so I'm curious to know what you have to say about people who are ostensibly in-group members, who are, in some senses, or in line with the type 3 that you'd mentioned, not all skinfolk are kinfolk.
Yeah, good. So one thing I want to point out is that though I talked about race primarily, race isn't the only thing happening in the formation of habitus, right? And so one thing that Ahmed, I think, also says is that, or is it Stuart, it might be Stuart Hall, to give you a UK reference. Hall talks about the race and class sort of co-forming, right? So being co-formative or not. I'm not sure there's an impasse with respect to the artist formerly known as Kanye West. I think there's grifting and opportunism. Similarly, I think a similar sort of thing with how you call him, Jay-Z. There's a kind of opportunism there as well. Right? So yeah, thinking, well, at least with respect to Mr. Zed, there is an attempt to push, again, a kind of line that has been present in the African American intellectual tradition already, right? Which is basically, kind of Black capitalism. Right? But we've seen that before, so he's not offering anything new. He's basically pushing a line that was already available hermeneutically within the sort of African American vernaculars that exist in the history of Black America. Contrast that with, I guess, someone like Jesse Lee Peterson. Think Candace Owen but sincere. So I think also Candace is a grifter. I don't think that's serious. So I don't really know his background. I don't know which communities he grew up in. But it's hard to, at least from where I sit, it's hard for me to wrap my head around how someone like him could think the things that he thinks. And because there are a number of different focal points in sort of the development of habitus, I mean, this happens across groups as well as within. Right? So just because we share a similar skin color doesn't mean we're going to share similar modes of understanding the world. And it need not be as drastic as me and Jesse Lee or Candace. Sincere Candace, not. It's going to be the same with me and my sympathetic counterpart in Ghana. Different conditions give rise to different modes of understanding.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question that's sort of trying to help me understand a little more about sort of habitus and what its practical implications might be for our politics. So it does sort of an acceptance of habitus as sort of one of the main ways in which race is embodied and experienced and frames sort of identities. Does that mean that the political focus should be on changing sort of socioeconomic conditions, because that is, and sort of reconceptualizing our history and counteracting these forces, because ultimately, even if you were to remove, say, all instances of racist language, if you still had sort of socioeconomic inequality, you're still going to have these very different sort of literal shapings of the bodies or shaping of the experiences. Or am I misunderstanding it, and actually is it more connected as well to sort of our linguistic framings of the world and our discursive framings of the world?
Yeah, good. So it's not just a changing of say economic conditions, right? So it's not strictly speaking just sort of a Marxist frame.
Right. This is what I'm thinking of it.
It's not simply changing discursive elements. Like the thing that I was trying to get at was something underneath, the thing that steams our discourses, really. And so, I guess, so if you enjoy Foucauldian sort of terminology, I might say, point to like the conditions of possibility or something like that. Right? So, full disclosure, I have no answers for how to do this. At the moment, what I'm thinking about basically are what I think the challenges are. I guess one important challenge is to deal with, well, some of the things that we routinely tinker with now seem to be sort of symbolic items or things that have symbolic value. But that's sort of too far ahead if we want to think. If what we want to do basically is change people's orientations to the world. If we think changing someone's orientation to the world is necessary for achieving certain kinds of social and political ends, then tinkering with the things that we normally tinker with now won't do that because it's too far afield. Like they're already bringing their interpretive schemes to those things with symbolic value and interpreting them in particular sorts of ways. That's right. Then we have to figure out, okay, how do we get back to the stuff that sort of determines how we understand, impose value on the symbolic things that we take in, and therefore determines our relationship, our political and social and moral relations with one another.
So you mentioned Miranda Fricker at a certain point in your talk, and I was thinking about her work on hermeneutical injustice in relation to your 4 types of impasse. And she gives the example of the woman who is offered the expression harassment, and suddenly this transforms her way of thinking about her experiences because there was something or other. You can't say she didn't experience anything, but she couldn't articulate it. Once she's offered the concept, makes a huge difference. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about the relationship between that kind of change where being offered a new concept makes a huge difference and the sort of change to the political or social imaginary that you were envisaging, because I was struggling with that, and I thought one difference that seemed salient to me was that in Miranda's case it's just one word or one concept that gets offered, whereas what you're talking about is something like, sort of alternative total narratives of something.
So in the Carmita Wood case that Fricker references, it's the explicit naming of an experience that's already partially recognizable that sort of gives it a certain kind of reality. If I remember that example correctly, part of the issue is, so she was attempting to apply for unemployment benefits, but because there was no singular expression she could use to describe her work conditions or whatever, she was denied, essentially. And Terrell talks about this. This is part of the work that social movements do, which is to basically emphatically name injustices, right? That gives it a certain kind of, that can give it a certain kind of purchase. The things that I'm focusing on, I think, are more, are tougher, because the kinds of understandings that are brought to bear rely on a broader narrative or a discourse or whatever. And those things tend not to be altered or changed significantly by the introduction of one word or concept. Right? They're much more entrenched, much more difficult to get at. That doesn't mean it can't partially be addressed by the introduction of some explicitly coined concepts or terms, but it's going to take more than that. But yeah, the way that the setup as you described is quite right. So that's the 2 things I'm sort of working between and trying to figure out, okay, how should we conceptualize and think of the second thing, the broader narrative thing, and then what sorts of remedies might actually be effective at addressing the issue. But so I'm starting, however, with the diagnosis. Right? So that's the part that I'm focused on now.
But it's harder because it's not just about naming an experience or introducing a particular concept. Yeah.
That's right.
I think this is more trying to figure out how to apply various things into this framework. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about false consciousness on the part of the oppressed and how that plays into the framework of a hermeneutical impasse.
So maybe one way would be a notion of self-understanding. Right, so, who is it? Escapes me. I was reading someone the other day, and I remember an idea about, well, in order for understanding itself to be possible, one has to first achieve self-understanding. And so if there are blocks of that, then, right. So if one is operating under false consciousness, obviously one's, I think sounds reasonable to say, right, that one's lacking in self-understanding. So maybe that suggests it's possible to be at a hermeneutic impasse with oneself. I don't find that an unreasonable thing to say, I don't think. I mean, I guess we do have these ways of speaking, these practices of speaking, where we talk about understanding ourselves or coming to figure out who we are, stuff like that, right? That seems to me like a kind of hermeneutic impasse, a kind of haven't yet come to grasp the concepts or whatever that allows me to provide a consistent, coherent narrative of myself, my identity. Like that. Maybe that's maybe that's where it fits in.
One central function of art could be to break hermeneutic impasses. I was wondering whether you agree with that. Could you elaborate as to how art could help do that?
So is it uses of art to do that? Yeah, I mean, so that's been, I think, a popular strategy to try to attempt to do this kind of work. So I think, so you find, I think, one example in the work of Suzanne Césaire, who appealed to surrealism as an attempt to, I guess, shake up troublesome dispositions, right? So the idea is that, I guess, surrealist engagements basically present you with really disruptive frames, essentially, that might cause you to rethink or reimagine things that than you would have otherwise done. Sometimes art can spectacularize certain elements that are often obscured or something like that. So it can make it salient, highlight something that might strike our attention, bring it, cause us to focus on something that we have overlooked or something like that before. And so particular sorts of artworks might do that. So one attempt at this might have been, so the fountain that Kara Walker produced that was at the Tate Modern a couple years ago, right? So it's basically a kind of commentary on public statues and memory, right? Where a lot of so I think it was sort of inspired by the memorial fountain or whatever. It's outside Buckingham Palace, I believe. And part of what she was calling the audiences to do was to rethink our engagement with our relationship to these kinds of monuments, and so what they're memorializing. And she just sort of made explicit what she thinks is implicit in most public monuments, right? Basically a kind of memorializing of colonialism and colonial relations and the Atlantic slave trade and so forth. And she just sort of made that explicit in her work, and that the work itself was meant to provoke our attention to those often underlying details that we overlook. So I think those are kinds of engagements that artists have tried to undertake, that I think try to get at this kind of at least our dispositions to understand things in particular ways that basically overlook a lot of things.
So it's would it be right to say would it be right to say that it's because of the historical habituses, like racial habituses, that we find ourselves today, with hermeneutical impasses? Okay. Do you think we could identify, or do you think there are other habitus habitus, I'm sorry, that are that lead us to like breach those impasses, for instance. Are there like habituses that we should pick out as good habituses or identify as?
I don't know. So I suppose I don't recall Bourdieu talking about habituses in terms of goodness and badness so much. But I guess if I'm following Baldwin, one of the central things seems to be so I'm going to switch to the language of history, but facing our histories head on. That as long as you are sort of running from certain histories, this won't allow you to be in a position to be transformed by various things, right? Because you're basically being a kind of protectionist orientation, a protectionist stance. And that can't be good for genuine understanding, right? So even though we find ourselves inheriting these histories, we're formed in particular sorts of ways, in principle it's possible to alter those things, but you have to face it in order to be able to alter it. And so that's sort of primary.
And then there was a question at the back. Two questions.
This actually springs from the previous question, and I was wondering how you view the fact that there is more than one type of colonial experience involving other racial mixtures, other racial realities, and to what extent you see that as a step forward, as the gentleman mentioned, in terms of not so much bridging, but creating new imagined realities of, for example, I'm going to take my own experience, my own as an example, simply because it's easy. I am of German-American, Chinese, Filipino mixture, and I have nieces and nephews who have that plus African-American and others. Do people like that, as separate communities, somehow constitute a habitus of their own that represent a progressive step in the direction that we would like?
It's possible, but it depends on how we tell the story of assimilation, not the implicit in it. And so, Linda Alkoff, in her article Mestizo Identity, basically describes kind of assimilation she thinks might work for a progressive mixed race identity. One that's premised on a certain kind of way assimilation worked in the global South, especially in Latin America. So she contrasts the concept of assimilation in use in the North, in the United States, where it uses the language of universalism, but it basically presupposes a white moneyed male subject as the standard for assimilation. That's contrasted with the southern bit, not southern USA, but Latin America, where the kind of amalgamation, the kind of non-hierarchical engagement with difference. Though she doesn't take so to be clear, she doesn't take the way that assimilation worked in Latin America, colonial Latin America, as itself the model, because it's still based on a particular kind of sort of imperialism, basically Roman imperialism. But she thinks that mestizo identity and mestizo people sort of offer us a kind of possible model where, kind of non-hierarchical assemblage, or what I might call bricolage. I guess one question I might have, though, is whether or not it's possible to get to a non-hierarchical bricolage. Right? You're always going to have to assume some sort of standard. Like, you're assimilating to something. There are choices that have to be made along the way. So you have to think about the basis for those choices. Like, how do we make them? How do we sort of decide, how to combine various elements? Maybe you can put them together, but some things have to be kicked, some things are going to be accepted, some things are going to be privileged, some things are going to be deprivileged, right? So one of the things that, I intended to include this in the talk, but it didn't come together for me, so I didn't include it, but this is a sort of a point that I do want to think about, and I don't know what I want to say about it yet, but essentially I want to think about what this kind of new assimilationism that Linda refers to might be, and contrast that with kind of idea we find, for example, in Du Bois's The Conservation of Races, where he thinks that the notion of race is necessary for the achievement of kind of, I guess, inclusive civilization. I mean, I'm troubled by his civilization talk, because I want to distance myself from that too. But provided it's not possible to think about a kind of smooth, egalitarian mixing, you might be stuck with something. What is that something, and can it do the kind of productive work that we think is not being done now? Because I don't really have that. I didn't include it because it didn't come together for me, but your question makes me think, like those are the thoughts that I'm having and trying to work out.
And then at the back.
My question is, in kind of movement and framing spaces, there's this idea that you should never repeat the frame of your opponent because it implicitly acknowledges that that's true. And so I guess my question is, do you think from the framework you're using that actually further obscures realities because you're not acknowledging past sometimes? Or is it actually helpful in creating the imagination and the futures that you need to do in the way that you were saying about whiteness not allowing?
About whiteness?
Not allowing for, because it's so all-encompassing that it's very hard to imagine the future if you continuously accept that frame.
This is putting me back in the mind of the Kwashi quote about what it means to imagine Black aliveness. Because it seems like the things that he's calling for basically requires me to adopt a new kind of imagination, but one that I might not have developed yet. So how do I get there? Because right now I just have what I have. And I guess in general, we all have different things. There's some overlap, right? Sure. But you also have what you have. The question, well, if it becomes necessary, if we think it's necessary to get to somewhere else, how do we get there? I don't think I have a good answer for this at the moment.
Well, you've had an answer to pretty well everything else. So perhaps that's a good point at which to draw the evening to a close, but not before thanking Luvell very much for a fascinating talk. Thanks so much.